The morning Della lost her job, the sky over Millhaven couldn't make up its mind. A thin rain kept starting and stopping on the windshield. She sat in the parking lot of the packing plant where she'd worked for 11 years, a cardboard box on the passenger seat with a coffee mug and a half-dead little plant inside, and she didn't cry. That came later, when there was no one around to see it. She was 33, divorced for 2 years, renting the bottom floor of a duplex on Carver Street, thin floors, so she could hear Pat moving around upstairs at 5 most mornings, getting ready for her hospital shift. The plant had handed out severance with a printed letter and a handshake from a manager who couldn't look anyone in the eye. 11 years, and it fit in a box smaller than her microwave. The only thing in the world that ever made Della feel like herself was the smell of bread coming out of an oven before the sun was up. Her grandmother used to bake in a kitchen the size of a closet, and Della had grown up on the sound of a wooden spoon against a ceramic bowl. She still had the recipe card, grease-spotted and gone limp at the corners, the pencil so smudged she knew it more by heart than by reading it. Her grandmother had pressed down hard on one word near the bottom: patience. So, on the drive home, with the box rattling beside her, she let herself think the thought out loud for the first time. Maybe I open the bakery. It sounded brave in the car. By the next morning, at her brother's kitchen table, it sounded a lot smaller. "Del," Russ said, not unkindly, stirring his coffee longer than coffee needs stirring. "We've already got Sunrise out by the highway, and Hoff's downtown. People go there. What are you gonna do that they don't?" She didn't have a clean answer. That was the trouble. "I'd just make it good," she said. And even to her it sounded thin. Russ gave her the look he'd been giving her since they were kids. The one that said, "You're dreaming again." "Market's full, kiddo. There's only so many loaves a town buys." The loan officer was politer and worse. He had a stack of papers and a small framed photo of a sailboat he probably didn't own. He listened, nodded, then slid a brochure across the desk like it was a consolation prize. "A bakery's a hard loan to write when the area's already got 2, he said. "There's not a lot of room in the numbers, and not a lot I can do for you today." Even Carmen, her best friend since the 9th grade, hesitated on the phone that night. There was a pause long enough to fall into. "I love you," Carmen finally said. "And I want this for you. I just don't want to watch you lose your shirt over bread, you know?" By the end of that week, Della had heard the same sentence in 5 different voices. "It's already being done." After enough times, she half believed it herself. She put the recipe card in a drawer under the takeout menus, and she took a part-time job working the counter at the Laundromat on 5th, making change and folding strangers' towels for people who tipped in quarters. The card stayed in that drawer for 2 months under the menus while she made correct, responsible change and folded other people's laundry. What changed things was an old man named Walter and a complaint he didn't know he was making. Walter came in every Sunday morning with a duffel bag of laundry and a thermos. He talked the whole time he was there, mostly to himself, sometimes to Della. One Sunday, he was unwrapping a sandwich he'd picked up at Sunrise, and he peeled the bread back, looked at it, and set it down without taking a second bite. "You know what I miss?" he said. "Bread somebody actually made. Hoffs used to bake their own, back when old Hoff ran it." Now it's his nephew, and the kid signed some supplier contract. It comes in frozen on a truck. It's not bad exactly, it's just always the same, you know? Nothing in it worth looking forward to. And the boy behind the counter doesn't look up from his phone when you pay. He shook his head. Same story out at sunrise. Fine bread, nobody home behind it. Della kept folding towels, but she wasn't hearing the dryers anymore, only him. Over the next month, she paid attention in a way she hadn't before. A young mom in the checkout line said she'd given up looking for a birthday cake that wasn't covered in that waxy frosting. A couple of nurses on a break wished out loud for somewhere warm to sit that wasn't the gas station. One evening, she walked past Hoff's and saw the lights off at 4 in the afternoon. A sign taped crooked in the window. Closing early. The nephew didn't leave a note. His parking spot was just empty. The town didn't have too many bakeries. That was the lie everyone had told her, including herself. It had 2 places that had stopped caring, that turned out bread you couldn't really complain about and couldn't love either, run by people who would never once learn your name. Nobody was angry enough to make a fuss. They'd just quietly forgotten that bread could be something you looked forward to. None of that showed up on the loan officer's spreadsheet, but she'd heard it plain enough in the breath Walter let out over that sandwich. Della didn't rent a storefront. She didn't have the money for that kind of swing. She started in her own kitchen on Carver Street, 2 loaves at a time, then 6, then a dozen, getting up before 4 like her grandmother used to. She burned the first batch black enough to set off the smoke alarm. The next one came out flat. She got the 3rd right and sat down on the kitchen floor and laughed at herself. She took a folding table to the Saturday farmer's market and set out 8 loaves with a hand-lettered sign. She sold 3. The next week, she sold 5. A woman came back the following Saturday holding her toddler's hand and said, "My husband ate half of it standing at the counter before dinner. He never does that." Della charged her for 2 loaves, gave her a 3rd for free, and drove home with $11 and a grin she couldn't wipe off. One of her steadiest regulars turned out to be Eileen, the pastor's wife, who bought 2 loaves every week and started talking about them to anyone who'd stand still after the service. But a few good Saturdays don't pay rent. The savings drained faster than she'd let herself admit. Flour and butter and good yeast cost real money, and the severance was nearly gone. She'd started counting what was left in weeks of groceries, not dollars. She kept the laundromat job and slept in pieces. By late August, she was sleeping in 2-hour stretches, and her hands had a small shake in them when she scored the loaves before dawn. The night it all caught up with her, she'd promised 3 dozen dinner rolls for a church fundraiser. Eileen had asked her personally after all those weeks at the market, and the dough was already proofed and shaped on the trays when her oven thermostat gave out. The dial said 350. The oven was barely warm. The first tray came out pale and raw in the middle. She caught it before she lost the rest, but by then it was past 4 in the morning, and she had 3 dozen rolls worth of dough sitting ready with nowhere to bake it. She sank down into the flour she'd spilled on the floor and cried without a sound, one hand clamped over her mouth. She had her phone in her hand, Russ's number open, the words, "I'm done," half-typed. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She's never been able to fully explain why she didn't send it. She sat in the spilled flour a while longer. Then, A little before 5, she heard the floorboards overhead. Pat, up and moving the way she was every morning before her hospital shift. Della didn't let herself think about it too long. She loaded the trays onto a sheet pan, carried them up the outside stairs in 2 careful trips, and knocked. Pat opened the door in her scrubs, took one look at Della's face and the trays, and just said, "Bring 'em in." Della slid the ones that had to wait onto Pat's cold back porch so they wouldn't overrise, and brought them in one at a time. Rolls bake fast. Pat made coffee, handed Della a spare key so she could lock up, and headed out for her 6 a.m. shift. Della got to the church a little after 8, with 34 warm rolls in a laundry basket lined with a clean towel, and red eyes she blamed on the flour. Eileen held her hand a beat too long and said they were the best thing on the table. Della made it back to her car before the crying started again. Walter found her at the market that next Saturday. He'd brought his wife, Ruth, who walked with a cane and didn't say much. Ruth broke off a corner of a loaf, chewed slowly, and her eyes filled up. "That's it," she said quietly. "That's the bread." Della showed her how to freeze a loaf the same day she bought it and crisp the crust back in a hot oven so it would taste close to fresh all week instead of going to stone by Tuesday. Walter didn't say anything. He just stared at the loaf like he recognized it. It spread through church pews and neighborhood gossip, word of mouth. It was Eileen who turned a good Saturday habit into something steadier. After the fundraiser, she asked Della to handle the bread for the church's Sunday coffee hour every week, a standing order paid on the 1st of the month. Word moved through the same circles it always had. The volunteer fire department wanted rolls for their pancake breakfasts. A women's group put in a weekly order of its own. None of it was glamorous, but for the first time, Della could look at a calendar and know money was coming in on a schedule. That order sheet was what finally got her off her own kitchen counter. She gave her 2 weeks' notice at the laundromat the very next morning. The narrow storefront next to the barber on Main, a defunct little lunch counter that still had its commercial wiring, a grease trap, and a 4-burner gas stove in the back, had sat empty for a year, and the landlord had stopped expecting anyone to take it. He didn't want a year's deposit up front. He wanted the place lived in. Della talked him into letting her pay by the month, low to start and climbing once she found her feet. New equipment was out of the question, not even close, but a diner 2 towns over had folded, and the owner was clearing everything out on Facebook Marketplace. Della drove out with a borrowed truck and James, a guy she'd been laid off beside at the packing plant, and came home with a dented but solid deck oven, a 20-quart mixer with a chipped bowl, and a second-hand coffee machine that hissed. She didn't open alone either. James' name had been right above hers on the layoff list, and he could swing a 50-pound sack of flour like it was a pillow, so she asked him to take a few shifts a week. Some mornings he ran the counter so she could keep her hands in the dough. Some mornings they traded. It was hardly an empire. 2 people and a chipped mixer. But it meant there was a second pair of hands when the line ran long, and she stopped trying to be a whole bakery by herself. She painted the place herself over 3 late nights, with Carmen showing up on the second evening carrying 2 paint rollers and a silent apology. They scrubbed every surface twice to pass the county health inspection. She couldn't afford a proper sign, so for the first couple of months it was just known around town as the bread lady's spot. It wasn't a clean climb after that. The rent that had felt manageable in spring started to bite by fall, and the second-hand oven drew more power than she'd planned for. She did the math at the kitchen table one night and nudged her prices up, not by much, a quarter here, 50 cents there. But in a town that small, people noticed. A few of her oldest regulars said so to her face. One man who'd bought a loaf a week since the market days set his money down, looked at the new number on the chalkboard and said, "Guess the bread lady's gotten fancy on us," and didn't come back for a month. That stung worse than any stranger ever could have. Then came the first real winter. The snow didn't empty her shop, it filled it, just not with buyers. People came in to get warm. They'd order the cheapest coffee on the board, take the seat closest to the radiator, and nurse it for 3 hours while the unsold loaves went stale on the shelf behind her. She couldn't bring herself to send anyone back out into the cold. But the heating bill climbed. The day's bread went home as her own dinner more nights than not, and she watched the bank app every morning and saw the number sliding the wrong way. She had to cut James' hours down to just Saturday mornings, paying him half in cash and half in leftover bread and soup, which he took without complaint. She came close to handing back the keys more than once. What saved that winter wasn't luck. It was Della finally running the math the other direction. She started a small lunch, a bowl of soup, and a thick slice of the day's bread for the price of a sandwich, built from the loaves that would have gone stale anyway. The people already parked by the radiator were glad to pay for something warm to hold, and the bread that used to be a loss became the cheapest thing on her menu to make. The room that had been costing her money slowly started earning it back. She never put up a sign or ran a special for it. She just set a pot on the back burner every morning and let the smell do the work. That winter, she also stopped fussing over the recipe and started learning her customers by name. She knew that Pat, upstairs, came off her night shift wanting her coffee scalding, that the toddler from the market was named Theo and was scared of the hiss the old machine made, so she learned to steam his mother's milk while he was busy at the window, that Walter took Ruth's loaf home wrapped in a cloth because the plastic bag made it sweat. She held cakes back for people who got paid on Fridays. She let the high school kids do their homework in the window seat and never charged them for the table. By February, there were regulars who came in and sat down without buying much at all, just to be somewhere warm that knew their name, and enough of them stayed for soup that the lights stayed on. A year and a half after the morning she sat in that parking lot with a cardboard box beside her, there was a line out her door on Saturday mornings. Russ came in one day, ordered a coffee, looked around at the full tables, at James boxing up the church order, at Walter and Ruth folded into the corner seat, and said, a little sheepish, "Guess I was wrong about the room in this town." Della just poured the coffee.